Everybody. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 3, Federalism. We're going to try it in this new mode that I figured out that's not Blackboard. It's just through PowerPoint, and we're going to see how it works and see if this is a tool that we can use in the future. Now, federalism is the division of sovereign power between different levels of government, or in our case, sovereign power is simply the level of power and autonomy that each level of government holds between the federal, state, and local governments. So each level of government, federal, has its overarching layout for how the government works. State governments can work within themselves, but underneath the role and protection of the state governments, or the federal government, excuse me. And then local governments get their power from what state governments get to them. So at the top, obviously, you got the federal government with the supremacy clause. In the middle, you got states that can act independently of the federal government, but also in lockstep with them, but never across lines or against them. And then local governments that derive their powers from, again, state governments, et cetera, et cetera. Now, federalism itself is the study or the relationship about those individual entities and how that power is divided. Broadly speaking, as you go from one to the other, needs and preferences are going to change in terms of what is required at their particular level. So we hear all the time that the federal government, for whatever reason, doesn't know what the people in Georgia need. Those idiots in Washington, they don't know what we need down here in Georgia. Well, you would hope that the state government does. And so we send forth representatives from Georgia, our state senators and our representatives for our individual districts inside of the state to Washington to give our needs at the federal level of Congress. And then we also have state representatives, state senators, the House of Representatives for the state, the governor, and then our local representatives as well, for the city councils, county commissions, et cetera, that at every level we have representation that we elect ourselves directly to represent our needs. Now, disagreement inside of federalism, and disagreement meaning what role the government should actually play in our society, is the main argument of any discussion about federalism and what a territory needs. The role of government, or what place the government should have in individuals' lives, is the general misunderstanding or argument to any discussion that you have for politics ever. And federalism seeks to explain that relationship. Now, the interpretation of policy across multiple levels of government accomplishes several things. First, it changes the way the individual policies are interpreted. Now, obviously, that's a redundant statement because I just said it. But the national government looks at climate change as, well, currently as a general non-issue. It's important, but it's a non-issue. But at the state level, the people of California has said that this is something that's important to us, something that we can do something about, and something that we're going to try to do something about. And they can make policies that actually start to engage that particular problem. There isn't a consensus at the top of the federal government, but the state has the right to go ahead and go on its own and try to combat it itself. Because federal and state governments interpret laws differently, there are also outside factors that come into play. First, interest groups and other stakeholders. Interest groups and stakeholders at the federal level are big tech, big pharma, the NRA, and the NRA, and each one of these covers multiple different jurisdictions, but especially at the federal level, that's where the big money is. Now, with that access that the interest groups have, you also have, as a personal citizen, multiple opportunities to engage. Those opportunities include writing letters, making phone calls to your congressman, showing up to town hall meetings when your representative is in town, et cetera, et cetera. You have the right, just like interest groups do, To get access to your senator or congressman, you just may not necessarily have the financial means that they do. Um, and then second, of course, is the role of courts in deciding the way that policy should be interpreted through the constitutional lens. Um, so the courts themselves, Madison, when he was writing the Federalist Papers, said that the court systems should be the least dangerous of all the new branches of government. And he said that because they don't have the power of the sword, they don't have the power of the purse, and therefore should be the least connected to the political machinations of the world, basically, and that they should be able to rule fairly and non-biasedly in the way that they handle their business. Well, the simple reality is that's not true. Um, the courts are politically motivated just like anything. There are groups like the Federalist Society that seek to promote conservative judges, judges that will rule on conservatively, or in the conservative lens, I should say, on issues like abortion, on things like gun rights, on drug usage, uh, things of that nature. Anything that you could think of that actually would involve a conservative hot button. And the same thing for liberal judges. You're looking for climate change, for reparations, even if you wanted to go that far with it. The Green New Deal, all those things are liberal hot buttons, and those things are also interpreted differently by liberal judges. It's not a one size fits all thing. The judiciary is not as second as we'd like for it to be. It's not as non partial as we would like for it to be. But that's just a symptom of a political system that allows um, politics to be so widespread throughout the system or throughout itself. That's just the name of the game, unfortunately. Now, both the federal and state level of government can implement certain policies without interfering with each other, which gives them their unique responsibilities. This is the whole idea of power sharing inside of federalism. The powers of the national government we've already discussed and much more to the states. So states, by themselves, through the Constitution, have the power to conduct elections and keep the public safe with police power. Local governments are products of the state and derive their power from the charters that the states assign to them. The national government also takes on additional power through implied powers, not flowers, sorry. Federalism allows for different opinions to exist across different states and why laws can vary from state to state. So, for example, Chicago, Illinois, or Illinois itself has very strict gun laws. The territories around it, Missouri, and I want to say Michigan's on the other side. I could be wrong about that. But there are states that surround Illinois that don't have as strong a gun laws as Illinois does. Part of the problems with Chicago right now is that the illegal gun trade, uh, guns can flow from both borders of Illinois into Chicago or into Illinois itself, and there's really nothing that you can do about it because the states around them don't have the same type of gun laws that they do. Now, that's one example of many examples, but that difference in how the law is interpreted from state to state can also plays into something called full faith and credit. Um, so the full faith and credit process is this: if you commit a murder in Georgia and you're sought for murder in Georgia and you run to Tennessee and you're caught in Tennessee, full faith and credit means that just because you ran to Tennessee, it doesn't make you innocent in Tennessee. The state of Tennessee can still send you to Georgia to face that murder charge. That's full faith and credit. Um, Same with illegal gun sales uh, across the country. If you break that state's laws, then you are to be held to the standard of that state, not to the state that you necessarily reside in. You have to comply with the laws within the state. Now, full faith and credit also guarantees that, and the Eighth Amendment as well, guarantees that while states can differ in the way that they carry out laws, they can't. There can't be a wide gap between penalties in one state versus penalties in another state. Okay, they're going to be either relatively close or at least within shouting distance of the penalties that you would receive in one state to the next. Now, the supremacy clause in Article 6 says that in disputes between the national and state governments, that the national government wins, always. If that's the case, how can laws differ? Well, there is no easy answer to this. Well, there is actually an easy answer, and I should probably put that out of the slide. Marijuana is a decent example of this current problem, and drugs in general right now. Some states have taken on the legalization of marijuana onto their ballots. And when they've been approved at that level with a popular vote of the state, generally the federal government, which still considers marijuana to be a Schedule I narcotic, the federal government has decided not to impose its supremacy over the state governments in that matter. They just decided not to touch the issue. Same for the treatment clinics in California. California has decided that they have clinics that will give you meth. Now the difference is it's safe meth or safe heroin, safe needles. You're not exchanging dirty needles, passing on disease, potentially killing yourself with an overdose. You're doing it in a controlled environment. And while it's not ideal that you're hooked on drugs, at the very least, we're keeping the death toll down. So that's kind of the trade-off. While the federal government may frown upon that, the state of California has decided that this is something that we're going to do. Assisted suicide as well. Many southern states have laws against assisted suicide. In Oregon and Hawaii, however, assisted suicide is almost encouraged in some way. You can actually request assisted suicide as part of your treatment plans, as I understand it. I could be wrong about that, but now in situations where the national government gives the state a waiver to differ, there is no mechanism to actually retrieve that waiver if, say, the national government says that states are allowed to do X, and then the opposing party that really hates the other thing, that thing comes into power and tries to take it away. It's ultimately going to come down to the courts on whether or not the legality of that issue is held or not. So, to give perspective from recent events, let's look at COVID and masking. The federal government has the right to mandate masks everywhere. They haven't. 90% of this is a political move where elected officials have made a decision that may be politically beneficial while simultaneously encouraging local governments to take action themselves. This is where the governors come into play and how they decide to handle the COVID situation based on their own information in their states. Governor Kemp, for example, lifted COVID restrictions pretty early in 2021. We are not out of the pandemic yet by any means. We are not. We still are seeing COVID deaths by the week. We are still seeing COVID variants. And it seems as if we're going to get to a point where COVID is simply going to be part of our lives. But we still have not reached, I hesitate to say herd immunity because herd immunity is not what this is. It's not that pie in the sky, everybody's gotten it, so now nobody can get it, that everybody thought it would be. It's still killing people. And killing people at a rate that is not acceptable under any other circumstances, except for we made COVID political. And we seem to have really looked at ourselves and looked at our neighbors and said, it's okay if you die as long as I can do X, Y, and Z. Um, Now, in terms of the state governments, again, state governments and especially the governors have the right to either restrict or loosen their COVID regulations as they see fit. But private businesses can still pretty well do whatever what they want, as long as what they are doing is in the interest of providing a safe environment for their customers and workers. So if they decide to mask, like Walmart employees generally, I think, have to, then masking will be enforced. If they decide not to, they have the right to opt out as well. The local governments give them that option. So it all depends on what you're comfortable with, really. That's kind of how power is shared under a federalist um, society. Now, test prong. This is the longer section of the chapter, and federalism has evolved throughout the nation's history, and the book really gives you a good explanation. Um, the way in which the government distributes aid to the states and then to localities is a particular notice. These methods are called categorical grants or grants in general, and there are three different categories. Categorical grants are very specific use of public money in specific areas of policy. They are developed to do one thing only, and very specifically, narrowly tailored the way that that policy is carried out. Block grants, on the other hand, just give states a chunk of funding, just a stack of money to do with as they please in multiple areas of policy, but once that money runs out, the money's gone. Now, categorical grants, in terms of like policy, are favored because they can be more finely controlled by the stakeholders that are actually lobbying for the money. They can be put towards specific projects and not towards anything else. Now, block grants, on the other hand, are generally liked by, think, conservatives, governors, especially with Medicaid. They want Medicaid to be spent in terms of block spending, and then once that money's gone, they want that money gone. They don't want to go back to the federal government for more money to handle healthcare costs. They want you to start paying out of pocket at that point. And that's a very, very oversimplified version of what that means. But um, but that's generally what they're talking about when we talk about block grant preference. Block grants allow you to work on a bunch of different things at one time, but they also allow you to have an end date for when uh, and be able to really siphon the way that the money goes in terms of the individual person. So arguments have been made that state and local governments are better equipped to distribute funds, but part of that problem is states and localities, especially during COVID, have been either slow or just plain negligent in how funds are actually distributed, especially when they don't agree with the programs. The eviction moratorium, where landlords were like, look, uh, there was a pause for a little while on rent, and landlords were like, we need our money. And the federal government said, well, we gave the state money, you have to fill out this form, and they will compensate you for the time that you're under during the pandemic. Well, the state didn't really have a good mechanism in place to give out that money. They didn't have a good system in place to really hand out the money in an efficient way. Same thing with the PPP loans. Those loans were supposed to go to payroll protection. And they did end up protecting payrolls, but they ended up protecting payrolls from people that didn't need protection. And those loans were forgiven by the federal government. And a lot of people that maybe didn't need the loans got the loans. Um, that is the definition of local relief that I'm using here. And there were other definitions of local relief that a lot of times, if you didn't know what you were doing necessarily, or you didn't have an in, your loans were potentially stopped, for example, in favor of someone who had a better lawyer than you did, or somebody that had a better in than you did. Or it could take the government weeks at a time to get back to you to tell you that your paperwork is wrong or whatever. There was a completely and totally inefficient system in place to actually distribute the funds from COVID relief. Now, a few things to mention about the way that stakeholders behave inside of this system. Politicians are corrupt. This is a phrase that is tossed around all the time without any true evidence. Getting into the corruption are not part of the argument. It's not really what I'm here for. But I will say that in any instance where the interest of one group interferes with the interest of another, there will never be a compromise. There's never going to be a middle ground in the case of interest between one group and another. Something you're going to hear a lot in the next couple of days, the debt ceiling, for example, is bipartisanship. There's no way that the Republican Party is going to let the Democratic Party come out smelling like a rose from the debt ceiling issue. They're going to make a fuss, they're going to make a stink, they're going to make it look like the government can't function, and they're going to make as much noise as they can. And that's just politics. I don't have any ill will towards it. It's just politics at the end of the day. But part of the problem with the idea that some of our senators are holding on to, like Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema, or even President Biden, the Democrats hold on to this idea that bipartisanship is still possible, and yet the Republican Party has shown again and again and again and again that bipartisanship is not their goal. Their goal is to win. And what they win is control over the government and all that fear that most conservatives have about small government goes away because these Republicans don't want small government. They want to use government to force their ideals onto average Americans, just like what they accuse Democrats of wanting to do. So, and Democrats the same way. When the Republicans are not in office and when the Democrats are in the majority, they want to allow things that Republicans don't like into the mainstream, and Republicans feel threatened by that. There has to be a middle ground somewhere, you would think, but with the way the political system works right now, there is no such thing as a middle ground here. There's just no such thing. Especially when the needs of one are being put over the needs of something else. It's just not going to happen. So that's the end of the federalism lecture. Thank you for listening. Let's see if